committee at AAR. And for most of those years, Stephanie was our staff liaison person. She's really the worker bee, and she's the one who gets everything done for the committee. So it's a pleasure to be working with Stephanie again. And whenever you see her, thank her for all of her efforts. If we could hear applause, I'd say let's give Stephanie a round of applause, but we thank you very much, Stephanie. First of all, I'd like to thank all of the attendees for participating in this event. I know you will learn something because I have some things not only on this topic to share, but some other things right up front. And as Stephanie said, direct all your questions to Stephanie. We'll deal with Stephanie at the end. I will also stay on the line for any open general questions. The basis of my comments today, I started in commercial real estate in 1974. I was in commercial mortgage banking, working on very large projects around the country for many, many years. Then I started at Richmond in 1992. I serve as a court-appointed receiver, do commercial property management, financing, and brokerage. So those are my real estate activities. Okay, the first thing I want to share with you, you will not find written down anywhere, and I suggest you take notes on it. This is very simple. There are 4 elements that are common in every investment. This is what I call my Montyism. And as an aside, I taught classes and owned a commercial education company for several years. And I could always let the people know, I know they will learn something from me because nobody has taught these 4 items, and they relate to every investment. It does not matter if it's a monetary investment, a marriage, going to school, or anything else. These are the 4 common elements. And if you remember them, it can be helpful in your transactions or in working with people. The first item is you must be putting something in. That's why it's an investment. So whatever you're putting in, let's assume it's money, you're putting money into an investment opportunity, whatever that is. In return for putting something into your investment, you expect to get something back. That may be the use of an asset. It may be a return of your money at an interest rate, but you expect something back in return. It might simply be appreciation. Whatever it is, you expect something back. The third item is time. There must be a passage of time. Investments typically are not instantaneous. They may be relatively short term, like maybe going to a horse race or buying a share of stock that's appreciating very quickly, but there is a passage of time. And the third item is risk. Every investment has risk, including triple net leases. So some brokers market triple net leases as no risk. That's not true. So the 4th element is risk. So those are the 4 things: something in, something out or back, time, and risk. Okay, the next item, we're going to talk about letters of intent, but what I'd like to do is put it in the context first of contracts. And I have just 3 paragraphs here that I can't say any better than what they are already written. This is off the internet. And if you can just bear with me, let me read this to you. And then I have some comments on letter of intent and letter of interest, and then we'll get into the handout. Contract definition: an agreement between private parties creating mutual obligations enforceable by law. The basic elements required for the agreement to be a legally enforceable contract are mutual assent expressed by a valid offer and acceptance, adequate consideration, capacity, and legality. In some states, element or of consideration can be satisfied by a valid substitute. Possible remedies for breach of contract include general damages, consequential damages, reliance damages, and specific performance. Okay, the key words that I read are offer and acceptance. Overview: contracts are promises that the law will enforce. Contract law is generally governed by the state common law, and while general overall contract law is common throughout the country, some specific court interpretations of a particular element of the contract may vary between the states. If a promise is breached, the law provides remedies to the harmed party, often in the form of monetary damages, or in limited circumstances in the form of specific performance of the promise made. Now, because we use forms, thank goodness we have forms to work with in real estate. Otherwise, we'd go nuts trying to prepare all the required agreements. Finally, one modern concern that has risen in the contract law is the increasing use of a special type of contract known as contracts of adhesion or form contracts. This type of contract may be beneficial for some parties because of the convenience and the ability by the strong party in the case to force the terms of the contract to a weaker party. Examples include mortgage agreements, lease agreements, online purchase or sign-up agreements, etc. In some cases, courts look at these adhesion contracts with a special scrutiny due to the possibility of unequal bargaining power, unfairness, and unconscionability. Okay, so I think the key things there I'd like you to remember are offer and acceptance. And because we use form contracts, they are subject to additional attention by the courts. So thank goodness we have a good staff at CAR Legal to make sure all of our forms are suitable in the state of California. Okay, now a letter of interest that we refer to today, or that lenders use today, started from what really were letters of intent. And what happened is a few years ago, I think it was either in Texas or maybe the Bay Area, a judge ruled that a letter of intent was a binding contract. Excuse me. And the effect of that is that all of a sudden we changed the name from letter of intent to letter of interest. And in so doing, we had to change the wording, and we took out the wording or the word of offer. We're not making you an offer. And at the end of the letter, we took out the word acceptance. So we don't want to use those words in a letter of interest. So hopefully that's clear to everybody. And just as an aside, we use these in leasing, do not use this in purchasing. If you're in a very large transaction, you may have attorneys draft a letter of interest for a purchase, but typically not. If you have a purchase, just go right to the purchase agreement and get it submitted and move ahead. For leasing, the intent of the letter of interest is to lay out the key economic terms of the transaction. The other terms, or the boilerplate of the lease itself, covers pretty much everything else relating to the transaction. But if it has to do with something economic or term or option, those are the critical elements of the letter of interest. So bear with me for a minute while I read just a section here. This is on a letter of intent, but just think of it in terms of LOI or letter of interest also, because these are important areas. A letter of intent, and sometimes capitalized as a letter of intent in legal writing, but only when referring to a specific document under discussion, is the document outlining the understanding between two or more parties, which understanding they intend to formalize in a legally binding agreement. The concept is similar to a heads of agreement term sheet or a memorandum of understanding. Such outline agreements may be merger, acquisition, transaction agreements, joint ventures agreements, real property, lease agreements, and several other categories of agreements that may govern material transactions. LOIs resemble short written contracts, but are usually in tabular form and not binding on the parties in the entirety. Many LOIs, however, contain provisions that are binding, such as those governing non-disclosures, governing law, exclusivity, or contracts to negotiate in good faith. An LOI may sometimes be interpreted by a court of law as binding the parties to it if it too closely resembles a formal contract and does not contain clear disclaimers. Okay, let's now get on to the sample letter that you have in front of you, starting at the very top under date. Okay, the date you're going to send out this agreement is the date you put on the date. If you have subsequent additions or changes to the letter of intent, or if the parties are going back and forth through the letters of intent, then you change that date to whatever is the then next date. You do not keep the same date on the form. So in this particular case, and just to give you the background of this letter, this was on a retail center in Orange County. We had a Korean broker present what was probably the best letter of interest I have seen, and I complimented him on it. And he had the economic terms spelled out, but he also was wanting to change certain terms in the boilerplate. So what I told him, and what I tell people who are trying to do that, is that I do not, in my role as company owner and the leasing agent, is I do not change the boilerplate. I fill in the blanks of the lease, and I have a 1 to 2 page addendum that are standard clarifications I make to the contract. And that's also where I might put in any customized paragraphs that I need. But I do not make boilerplate changes. And I say that very firmly, and the parties back down. So there are some things in this one that normally might not be there. And this is a little longer than most LOIs. So, okay, we have the date, then we have who this letter is going to. You could put it to either the broker you're sending it to, or to the client, care of the broker, and their title, company name, street address, city, state zip. Letter of interest, property address, Harbor Boulevard, Unit C. You want to make it very specific. Costa Mesa, California. Then your greeting salutation. So we say, based upon our discussions and information provided by you and your client, we are submitting this formal letter of interest for your and your client's consideration at this time. So we're not saying we're offering them anything. We're submitting this letter of interest. This letter supersedes your letter of interest because this broker gave me his LOI before this one. I do not accept anybody's LOI for my client to sign. I always turn the transaction around and put it on my LOI format. So this letter supersedes your letter of interest dated September 15. This matter has been discussed with the owners of the subject shopping center. Parties, lessor. Okay, you want to put in the correct name of the lessor and that what type of entity is it? Is it a California corporation? Is it a partnership? Is it an LLC? Whatever. Same for the lessee. What's the lessee's name? And what is its legal capacity? In this case, both for California corporations. The premises, property address, unit number, zip code, square footage. Okay, in this case, approximately 836 square feet. If you haven't heard this before, whenever you're addressing square feet, you always use the word either approximately or a plus and minus sign. You can be legally held accountable if you do not do it that way, because you're giving then a specific amount of square footage, and if somebody measures the space and it comes out differently, that can be a problem. Also, in commercial real estate, there are very specific definitions of how you measure square footage in a building. And that can vary if you're using the gross area, the net area, the rentable area. And we're not specifying here how the square footage is measured, but by using the word approximately, you have some wiggle room. Okay, term. So we have the term of this lease is 10 years and 3 months. The commencement date is December 1, ending date February 28. Dates may be subject to change based upon processing time. In this particular case, the property owner is in Hong Kong. Also, in my leasing, how I like to lease space is to be able to offer 1, 2, or 3 months of free rent up front and add that to the term of the lease. And then in giving the free rent to the tenant, which helps them move in, start marketing, get their inventory and so forth, I give them the free rent up front, but they pay the net or CAM charges, or on the lease form we use, which is the AIR, multi-tenant retail lease form, it's referred to as common area operating expense. Okay, so dropping down to base rent of initial term, we have free rent, tenant to pay a CAOE charge. Then after that, those 3 months, the rent starts, and it's so much per month plus CAOE. So that takes care of the first page. Okay, page 2. At the top, we have percentage rent. So what is percentage rent? That you don't see that too much anymore, except in big leases. A percentage rent is a percentage of sales that the retail tenant may pay above a certain minimum in the lease. I've only had a couple, and I've managed many shopping centers throughout Southern California. If we have a lease with a percentage rent in it, we will get maybe quarterly statements on what that would be. I've never had one where it's kicked in. So you just don't see it on typically mom and pop transactions. You just don't see percentage rent typically in the transactions. Okay, lessee share of CAOE. So that's their percentage of the building area that is attributable to the space they are occupying. So you take their unit square footage divided by the total building area, you get the percentage of the CAOE. Typically, it's not carried down to 4 or 5 decimal places. It may just be rounded to 18%, but you don't want to short yourself. So So oftentimes it will go to 2 decimal places. In this particular shopping center, we do not have a merchants association, so there are no annual dues. Okay, let me back up for a second. The order of these topics in the letter of interest is based upon the order they are presented in the AIR retail multi-tenant lease form. So whenever I'm going to prepare the lease, I just go down these sections in order. Now, some of the later sections may not be in the same order they are in the lease. But in my standard form, which we're talking about here, these are in the same lease order they are in the lease form. So, base rent and other due upon execution. We have the base rent for the first month, which starts in March of 2019. So we put the period that base rent applies. We have the CAOE amount paid or to be paid. We indicate the period that that's for. We have the amount of the security deposit. Merchants dues 0, other 0, total due is the sum of those 3 things. This is due at signing, and that's $7,000 plus. Agreed use. Now, you need to be very careful with the tenant as to exactly what they're doing, with their product line, and so forth. In a small shopping center, I will not put in tenants that duplicate each other. So I want to agree what they're going to do. If it's food service, they can change their menu from time to time. If it is food service, I try to visit, if they have other stores, I will try to visit one of their other stores to see what their menu looks like, how the store appears, if it looks efficient, if it's clean, and so forth. So for any food uses, I do try to see other locations that they have. Also, you want to put in, as stated at the very bottom, no other uses shall be permitted. Typical in leasing, you may have a clause that would say, or any other legally or lawful use they could put in. Well, I want to regulate in my shopping centers what that use can be, again, because I do not want it to compete with other tenants in the shopping center who may be there now or who may come in the future. But whoever's there now gets precedence over any other, over tenants coming in the future. Now, because of, there can be use restrictions in the lease. So following the agreed use, we have use restrictions. So we don't want them to compete with other tenants in the center. So we may define what the other tenants do. There may also be use restrictions in particular tenant leases. As an example, 7-Eleven has quite a lengthy list of their items that they have exclusive sales rights to. So if that's the case, you may want to either in the use restriction or in exclusives, carve out what cannot be done by the new tenant entering the shopping center. Also, if it's in a large shopping center where there could be multiple owners, there could be CC&Rs or covenants, conditions, and restrictions that may also restrict the tenant's use. So in a big center, you want to check and see if in the CC&Rs there are any exclusives. Excuse me, top of page 3, agreed trade name. This is the name of what the tenant's going to, use in their store. Lease guarantors, okay. In this particular case, the company, which is a corporation, is owned by two individuals who are a husband and wife. Now, for my years in the business and in structuring both commercial loans or, excuse me, real estate transactions, if I have an entity, meaning a corporation, partnership, LLC, as the tenant, which is very common, then we want the lease guarantors to execute the guarantee form of the lease. So we spell out who they are, what their relationship is. They shall jointly and severally guarantee the lease. What that means is I can go after both of them. I can go after one of them. So in all of my lease, what I would call underwriting, we ask for lease guarantees. If an individual is the tenant, John Smith as an individual is the tenant, then you don't need a guarantee form. Now, if John Smith is not very financially strong, you may want a third-party guarantee. But if he is strong, then because he's directly on the lease, he's the one who's legally liable. Okay, existing conditions. In this case, we had certain equipment that we were leaving there so they can accept the equipment. And otherwise, they should be accepting the space as is, assuming it's in vanilla shell condition, meaning we've got white walls, white ceiling, and whatever the floor is in our leasing. We don't know what kind of flooring the tenant's going to have, and therefore we leave that up to the tenant. They can either accept what's there or remove what's there and put in new floor covering. Typically, I'll give them like a $2,000 allowance to put in whatever floor covering they need. Lessors work, none, except it may be required under condition of the premises below. And we typically, in our centers, do not give a tenant improvement allowance. But in many centers, particularly new centers, a common area allowance is a tenant TI allowance is common. This would also relate to office buildings and so forth. Okay, lessees work. They're responsible to fixturize the space for their use. They are responsible for compliance with all city, county, state, federal requirements pertaining to lessees improvements, use, and business operations. In our lease form, we get a little more detailed in lessees work. Insurance, upon lessee's execution, they'll obtain insurance. Okay, some of these were items that the broker presented in his LOI that we might not address in our LOI, but because he did, then I did. So we talk about signage. They're to comply with lessor sign criteria, which we attach to the lease. So all signage is a lessee's sole expense. And we put in where they're going to have their signs. But if it's a new center, you may have what they call cabinet signs or install cabinet signs for each of the tenant. And if there's a pole sign or monument sign, that would be the lessor's responsibility to provide the signage initially, but the tenant's responsibility to maintain a cabinet sign, meaning subsequent electrical replacements or repairs. On a monument sign, typically the landlord would make the repairs. But the ongoing maintenance of the sign, the electric to the sign, it would all be part of the common area expense or the triple net charges. Then we talk about the option to extend, in which case this one was 1 5-year option, so you want to make that very clear. Top of page 4, we talk finishing off the option on the first couple of lines, and then the option rent. Starting option rent is based on 3% increase over the base rent of the prior year. Thereafter, the same rate to increase annually in a step-up lease fashion. So there are many ways of increasing the rent in a lease. Common ways could be a CPI, but when CPI is so low, you don't want to be locked in long-term with a very low CPI. So doing this type of work for the last 20 years, we used to increase rents at a 4%. And what happened is we got tenants at rents above market. And then when the tenant was trying to release space, we might have to reduce the rent because the step up was above what the actual increase was. So a 3% annual step up seems to be marketable, and I think it's probably closer to reality, at least at this time in our business cycle. Okay, in this particular shopping center, there was an outdoor seating area. So we addressed the outdoor seating area. And in the lease, we may have pulled the wording in here and put it right in the lease because, you know, if we have some pretty good wording, we don't have to duplicate it or come up with something different just to restate what we're trying to do. So common area, maintenance, taxes, and insurance. Again, this is what he talked about. So we just addressed that topic in the LOI, where we said that's what the tenant pays. Another topic he covered was ventilating and air conditioning, so we addressed that. When we turn over space, we make sure the air conditioning is working, or if it's not working, we will pay for the first air conditioning service so that it is working for the tenant, and thereafter the tenant picks up the expense. Utilities, tenant agrees to pay directly all services, which are separately metered to the premises. Typically, water is not individually metered to the tenant. So the water is a house expense, unless there's a reason why we break off a separate meter to bill the tenant directly for water. So water is typically a house expense. Condition of the premise. Lessor shall make sure all existing electrical, plumbing, lighting, HVAC system, and the entry doors are in good operating condition at the time of turnover to the lessee. While following the turnover, the lessee assumes all such repair expenses. So again, we make sure all existing electric, plumbing, lighting is working, HVAC, either it's working or we'll pay for the first service. And tenants typically have responsibility for their glass and their door, but we want to make sure the door is in good condition when they take over, and thereafter it becomes their responsibility. Assignment and subletting, again, that's a standard wording of the lease agreement, so that's what we do, is what the lease agreement says. ADA requirements. Well, ADA is what, 10 or 20 years old now, I think, in how long it's been around. So we basically say that if it's outside, it's the lessor's responsibility to maintain, and if it's inside the lease premises, it's the tenant's building plans and other information. We're basically stating here that we, as the owner, do not have any plans on the building to turn over to the tenant. Contingency. Now, always have a back door. And your back door is that the owner has to approve things. So we say here, the letter of interest will be subject to the following: lessor's review and approval of terms and conditions, which are further contained in the lease agreement. Lessor's review and approval of lessee's most current financial and credit information on the entity signing the lease and any and all parties guaranteeing the lease. Lessor to review and approve the design, plan, signage, and materials used for the lessee's build out of the space and the lessee's furnishings for the outside patio area. Okay, exclusives. In this case, what that means is, are we giving the tenant any exclusive rights to sell any particular product? In a 7-Eleven lease, they have their own lease forms and they have a very long list of exclusives that are exclusive to them to sell. If you put in a tenant who competes with those exclusives, you can be sued. And I had that happen on one shopping center where before we took over the management of it, there were two tenants who were making sandwiches and one sued the other. It cost the owner, I think, $100,000 in damages, and the second tenant relocated. Lease form. So here we're presenting the lease form we're using and what all the other documents are that become part of that lease form. So there's no doubt as what forms we're using, because they're spelled out right up front. Real estate brokers who identify who the listing broker is, who the tenant rep broker is, how they're sharing their fee. And then the next three letters are basically boilerplate to make it clear that this is a letter of interest. It's not a binding contract. It does not constitute a binding contract. It's to be followed by an executed lease agreement signed by the parties and delivered to all parties, which I would like to emphasize. I was managing a bunch of properties in Compton. We had a tenant move in. We didn't know specifically what he was going to be selling because he used hedge words. It ended up that he was going to be selling marijuana. So even though he signed the lease, I never delivered the lease to him. Therefore, the lease was not binding. A few months later, the FBI came in, wanted us to boot him out, which we did. They also put him in jail. But because I never delivered the lease to the tenant, he did not have a right to stand on the lease to argue or closing down his store. So delivery of contract documents is what's the final step in making everything enforceable. Then we have our expiration date. Usually I would give them 10 days. And then you can sign the letter. Then we have confirmation of interest. So instead of saying acceptance that we might have put in under a letter of intent, we have confirmation of interest. So we're saying the proposed lessee and its agent find the above terms of interest not acceptable, of interest, and request the lessor prepare a formal lease agreement in accordance with the terms, and then have the broker sign it and the tenant sign it, and you're ready to go. So again, we avoid offer, we avoid the word offer, we avoid the word acceptance. We have a back door that this is both non-binding, but that it's also subject to the lessor's review and approval of many, many things. So with that, hopefully you've all been able to follow it. I'm happy to receive any questions and also stay after any questions on this particular topic to any other general questions that you may have. So let me call on Stephanie and ask Stephanie if there are any questions that have been submitted thus far.
Thanks so much, George. I do not see any questions in the chat box at this time. So anyone who does have questions, please go ahead and type those in the chat box, or feel free to unmute yourself if you'd rather just vocalize the question. But at this time, I don't see anything. George, thank you so much, though. Just in the meantime, while we're waiting for questions, that was extremely helpful to have that guide for anyone who needs to have a letter of interest or letter of intent for their business. That was really great to have a step-by-step outline of it. And also, everyone should have been able to have access to the document to download. If not, you can certainly type that in the chat as well if you need me to forward that to you. But I still don't see any questions, George. So we can hang on for another minute or so to see if anyone has any questions they come up with, but I'm not seeing anything at this time.
Okay, let me just ask while we wait a second here. If you don't have legal counsel in your firm, you should have them look at it. You should also have a forms file so that as you get letters of interest, you have a resource to improve your own form of letter of interest. Whenever I get a letter of interest, I always read it carefully. If there's anything I want to add into my form, I will do that on the next time I have to do my form. So collect sample documents when you can. And I'm not an attorney, but if you have any legal questions, you should see the legal counsel for your company, or if you have a friend who's an attorney, whatever. Okay, I did see a question pop up. So what was that question? Stephanie, did we have a question?
No, so there's a couple people who've requested that I go ahead and forward the LOI to them again directly, but I still don't see any questions. Just people, some of the attendees asking for me to forward it to them, but still no questions at this time.
Okay.
I do have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of direct a message to you, George. I was wondering, is this the format to use now for purchase of or interest to purchase a property as well? You call it the letter of interest, not letter of intent anymore. Is that correct?
No, I would recommend on a purchase, you go directly to a purchase and sale agreement.
No, I mean to write, used to be that we write them, we write a letter of intent, right? Just to present to the agent, the agent, listing agent that we're interested in the property.
I understand your question. What I said earlier was I recommend you do not use a letter of intent on a purchase. I recommend you just go to the purchase agreement.
Okay.
And lay it out and go direct.
Got it. Thank you.
I once drafted one of these, which was both a letter of intent to purchase and a letter of intent to lease. And it was on a property owned by the state of California. And it took a long time to prepare it. And it kind of just came off too complicated. So I recommend on a purchase, you just go to the purchase agreement, all of your terms are there, and just use that, and just use a letter of interest for commercial leases.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
George, we did have a question come in. Can you share your thoughts on AIR commercial forms for leases and sales versus CAR forms?
Well, CAR forms for residential are outstanding. For commercial, you could use either the CAR form or the AIR form. If you're dealing with a major brokerage company, they would expect to see you use a AIR form. For smaller transactions, and depending on the sophistication of the agents, you could use a either CAR or AIR forms. I prefer personally the AIR forms. I think they are simpler to use and present. And because CAR, which does have a great legal staff, they also like to write lots of contract forms or lots of agreements and lots of forms for you to use. So you don't have as many forms to work with AIR. I'm not sure you need a lot of forms, but I think the AIR is simpler to use. Enforceability is the same between both of them. The attorney for AIR forms is Brian Mashian, who's an excellent real estate attorney. This particular shopping center of this letter of interest, we sold about a year and a half ago at a very high price in Orange County. The broker was a residential broker with Berkshire, and outstanding broker, one of the most finest brokers I've met. And he used the CAR form. So when we responded to the offer with everything we had to provide to him, we had a very detailed list of everything we were providing to the buyer and the broker. On that particular shopping center, my due diligence package that I sent out, we had 12 offers come in. My due diligence package was 222 pages long, which was, well, not my due diligence package, my offering package. My offering memorandum was 222 pages long. So we do things very thoroughly, and everything we get, we double check to make sure everything's accurate. Questions? You're welcome, Henry.
We did have a question. Many people are familiar with the term letter of intent. However, your example talks about letter of interest. So can you explain just the difference between letter of intent versus letter of interest? Is there a difference, or are they the same form, just more of a modernized term for one of them?
Really more of a modernized term because of how a judge ruled on a letter of intent. So to make it clear, we use letter of interest. And again, we avoid the words offer and acceptance. Because if you make an offer and it's accepted, you have a contract. So to stay clear of that, we use letter of interest so we don't get it confused with a letter of intent, because a letter of intent is saying, you do this for me and I'll do this for you. I'll pay you something if you do this for me. I intend to pay you and you intend to do something for me. So you avoid that confusion, which is why lenders and agents should use letter of interest. LOI can mean either as an abbreviation, but you want to make it very clear that it's a letter of interest. Otherwise, you are taking some risk.
I don't see any other questions at this time.
Okay, well, if none, we can sign off and thank everybody for your participating. And hopefully it was beneficial to you. And again, we thank Stephanie for her excellent help in putting this whole system together and staying on the line to help us through our presentation. Thank you all very much.
Absolutely. And thank you so much again, George, for sharing your knowledge with us. We truly appreciate it. And we hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you so much again.
Bye-bye.